Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out for the annual North Georgia Reads program. And stay tuned in January for North Georgia Kids Read program. I want to first thank our dulcimer players, Ro, Peggy, Vicky, Brigitte. That was really a treat to have that in it. And of course, it all ties back to our author of the day's work. Sharyn McCrumb is an award-winning Southern writer, best known for her Appalachian ballad novels set in the North Carolina, Tennessee mountains, including New York Times bestsellers, The Ballad of Tom Dooley, She Walks These Hills, and The Rosewood Casket, published by Ataria Simon & Schuster in May of 2016. That tells the story of a sheriff, Prayers the Devil Answers tells the story of a woman sheriff in Depression area Appalachia. Her novel Kings Mountain in 2013 received the DAR award from the Edgar Buncombe chapter and the 2015 Patricia Wynne Award for Southern Fiction from the Montgomery County Arts and Heritage Council of Clarksville, Tennessee. Kings Mountain is taught in schools and is featured in a number of historical museums. Sharyn's other best-selling novels include The Ballad of Frankie Silver, the story of the first woman hanged for murder in the state of North Carolina. Ghost Riders is an account of the Civil War in the mountains of Western Carolina, and it won the Wilmer Dykeman Award for Literature, given by the East Tennessee Historical Society, and the Audie Award for the Best Recorded Book. And some of those books are for sale over there on that table with our wonderful booksellers, Eagle Eye Bookshop of Decatur. A graduate of UNC Chapel Hill with an MA in English from Virginia Tech, she is honored as the Writer of the Year at Emory and Henry College in 2005. Her novels have been translated into 11 languages, and she has lectured on her work at universities and museums throughout the United States, as well as at Oxford University, the University of Bonn, Germany, and the Smithsonian Institution. Ms. McCrumb taught a writer's workshop in Paris and has served as writer-in-residence at Tennessee's King University and at the Chautauqua Institute of Western New York. Please help me welcome Sharyn McCrumb.
Thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see summer weather a little longer because I live in Virginia and we're already breaking out the wool sweaters. So one more day here and then I go back to another season altogether. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains in southwest Virginia between Roanoke and Virginia Tech on the Appalachian Trail. And my ancestors settled in these mountains in the late 1700s. One of them fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, and another one had practiced law in New Jersey after having been kidnapped as a child from an island off the coast of Scotland. And they both ended up homesteading on what was then the North Carolina frontier. So my roots go back into that region a long way. And I try to do two things with my books. The first thing is to trace the geologic and cultural connections between our mountains and the mountains of Britain. If you've read The Songcatcher or She Walks These Hills, you may know this, but the Appalachians, people tend to think of it starting at Springer Mountain in Georgia and following the Appalachian Trail all the way up to Mount Katahdin in Maine. But in fact, the mountains themselves extend beyond those 2 points. The mountains rise in North Alabama around Talladega. Those foothills are the beginning of the Appalachians. And they go up through here and up through upper South Carolina, East Tennessee, North Carolina, all the way up through Pennsylvania and New York and up into New England. And finally past Mount Katahdin into Canada, the province of New Brunswick, and end in Campbelltown, right where the ocean starts. So it's a very long chain, and I know that there are different names: the Smokies, the Blue Ridge, the Cold Hollow Hills of New Hampshire, the Alleghenies, the Poconos, but those are all just local names for parts of one long Appalachian chain. And there's a mineral called serpentine that runs through those mountains. It's buried deep in the earth. If you go to a gem show, they will show you serpentine because you can dig it up in all of those states. That vein of serpentine goes all the way up and into Canada. And if then where Canada ends and the ocean begins, if you did core samples in the Atlantic, you wouldn't find that vein of serpentine. It's not there because these mountains are older than the ocean. So skip the ocean and go to Ireland. And there in the west coast of Ireland, in Connemara, along with the Connemara marble, you will find that same vein of serpentine that you just left in Canada. It goes up through Ireland, under the Irish Sea, and into Cornwall, from Cornwall into Wales, a bit into North England, Scotland, the Orkney Islands, and finally ends in the Arctic Circle. And what geologists have only discovered in the past 30 years is that vein of serpentine is important. It's like mountain DNA. And what it means is that 250 million years ago, before fish even existed, the mountains here in North America and the mountains of Britain fit together. They were one long mountain chain. And then very slowly, at the rate of 4 centimeters a year, plate tectonics and seafloor spreading caused the ocean to at first trickle in and then get bigger and bigger. So 250 million years is a long time for renovations. And in that time, you got an entire ocean between those two chains of mountains, but they're still the same mountains. And there was a time before people existed that you could have stepped from Canada to Britain. And now the ocean separates us. But the fact that they're the same mountains is important because, first of all, there's physical similarities. So many times I will go to programs and people will come up and say, well, I lived in Michigan or I lived in Kansas or Arizona, and when it was time to retire, I went to Florida like you're supposed to. And then they say, and I hated it. And then they'd say, then I read your book, She Walks These Hills, which talks about the mountains here. And I called a realtor and went to Western North Carolina and bought a house. At this point, I'm getting nervous and thinking perhaps they're not happy. But I said, I hope you like it. And they go, yeah, I'm home. And almost invariably, these people have last names that go back to Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall. They're back in the same mountains that their ancestors had come from. And when the people came over here, the ones who came over early settled the eastern seaboard. So if you're looking at Savannah, for example, you're going to find the English. They settled in the flatlands along the coast. But the people who settled the mountains, which in Georgia is the north, in North Carolina and Virginia the west, and in Tennessee the east of those states, they tended to be the people who didn't work and play well with others in Britain. So that would be the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and the Cornishmen. When they came over, the land on the eastern seaboard was already taken, and they wouldn't have wanted to stay there anyway. If you want to understand the fact that there are two Souths, you could rent for the Flatland South, for Savannah and Charleston, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina, all those coastal cities in the South. You could rent Gone with the Wind, or Steel Magnolias, or the Ya-Ya Sisterhood if you must. But if you want to understand the Mountain South, which is an entirely different culture, the movie to rent is Braveheart, because that's who settled here, and that cultural dissonance between the English and the Celts came over with the settlers in the 18th century. They came over here and got off where everybody else did when you take the boat over from Europe, you know, all the coastal cities, and stepped out and hated it. First of all, you could see the neighbors. And secondly, the humidity and all of that, and it was flat. So they kept going west. They would follow the valleys between the mountains. And when they got to the place where the ridges rose and you could stand on one hilltop and look across and see mountains on the other side, it felt right. And so that's where the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh homesteaded when they got here. And what they never realized was that they were right back in the same mountains they had just left. But it is the same mountains. I call that the serpentine chain that connects us with Britain. So not only are we connected with them by geography, which is I think why people felt impelled to settle here. My ancestors were Malcolm McCurry from the island of Ela off of the coast of Scotland, and the Arwoods from Yorkshire, North England, and Jonathan Tipton, who was also, I think, English. So yeah, it was the English and the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh all settling up in these mountains. And they brought their culture with them. So not only are we connected geologically, we are connected culturally. In 1916, there was a man named Cecil Sharp who wanted to collect the old traditional folk songs from the British Isles. And he went around trying to find people who knew those old songs. You know them, but nobody back then did. Barbara Allen, The False Night on the Road, The Unquiet Grave, all the old traditional folk songs that if you're old enough to remember the 1960s, Peter, Paul, and Mary and Joan Baez sang for you. Well, back in 1916, nobody remembered them in Britain. They had radios and they were singing music hall songs. And Cecil Sharp despaired of ever finding anybody that could teach him those songs. They had been forgotten. And then he got a letter from Olive Dame Campbell, who founded the Campbell Folk School, which is up there on the Georgia border in Brasstown, North Carolina. It's still in operation. So if you want to learn how to be a blacksmith or make raku pottery, there's your place. Mrs. Campbell was there in the early part of the 20th century, and she wrote a letter to Cecil Sharp and said, you know those songs you're looking for all over Britain? They're here, but you better get here fast before the radio does. And he came over. The areas were so remote and the roads so bad that he got a mule and rode from one community to another on muleback with a pen and paper, because he had the ability to write down musical notation, and then a couple of days later he could look at those music notes and get the tune. So he would have people sing for him, and he would write down the words, and then in musical notation he would write the tune. From one woman in Hot Springs, North Carolina, which is just above Asheville, her name was Jane Hicks Gentry, he got 500 songs from one person. All those songs you did hear in the 60s from Joan Baez and Judy Collins and Peter, Paul, and Mary were preserved only because Sharp published a book with Oxford University Press called Folk Songs of the Southern Appalachians, with the tune and the words, and he preserved them. And when our folk revival happened in the 60s, that's what it was based on, because everything else would have been lost if it hadn't been for us. So my question to my sociology friends was, okay, how come the people who originated those songs, the English and the Scots, and why had they forgotten those songs? And how come there's a bunch of people sitting in North Georgia and Western North Carolina who know those songs, letter perfect, and still remember the tune? And the answer to that is something called the Old Village, New Village theory. And it's this. If you live where your ancestors have lived for generations and for centuries, nothing's going to change in your life. You're going probably to the same church that your ancestors went to. They're in the graveyard if you want to check in on them. You may live in the house where they lived, or at least it's down the road where you can see it. The birds are the same, the trees are the same, everything stays the same. So that frees you up as a person. You have got a base, an anchor. You've got roots. So you can go out and have adventures and try new things because you got that safety place to come back to. You have seen this with your kids, some of you, haven't you? They go off to college and they want to go bumming around Europe and they want to try all these wild and crazy things. But when they came home for Thanksgiving, don't you dare rearrange the living room. Don't you dare change their room. That's the base. That enables them to go out and have adventures. The fact that you are supposed to stay the same. And it works that way with the whole culture. So the people back in England went off and tried new things because they had that safety net. But what about the rest of us? What about our ancestors? The ones who came to this country on a tiny little ship in the 18th century, and all they could bring with them was about one trunk full of usually clothes, maybe some spoons, very little. What they could really carry with them is what they carried in their heads. That was all they had of home. The songs, the stories, the quilt patterns, the fiddle tunes, all that had to be carried in the memory, and it was all they had left of home. And they got to this country, and it was completely different from England. Oh, we tried. We named places after places in England, like Albany, and the robin in this country is not the same as an English robin, but we wanted a robin so badly, we picked anything that had orange on it and said, you're going to be a robin. But they're completely different species. One's a flycatcher, and one's a thrush. There were no apple trees in America when the colonists got here. Apple trees are not native to North America. So much for American is apple pie. All the apple trees in this country are descended from the ones that came over in pots on boats or came over in a package of seeds. So many of the things that we take for granted weren't here. There were no honeybees in America when they got here. They were brought over from England. So here are these people in an alien place. No apple trees, the birds are different, the trees are different, everything is strange. And they want something to remind them of home. And that's what they had to remind them of home. The songs and the stories and the quilt patterns and the fiddle tunes. And they treasured them. And they handed them down from generation to generation. That's why when Cecil Sharp went looking for those songs, we had them and Britain didn't, because this was all we had left of home. And that was, I think, important to remember. And one of the things that I do in my books is to try to see what we have in common, what we brought with us, and what we would recognize when we went back. I noticed, for example, with the songs, that what they did was to change the details and keep the plot and the tune of the songs. So there is a song that they sing in Tennessee that starts, I met a little girl in Knoxville. And if you go to Ireland, they'll be singing, I met a little girl in Wexford. But she still ends badly. The plot is the same, but they changed the details. There's another one Peter, Paul, and Mary used to do called The Lily of the West. And it goes, when first I came to Louisville, some pleasure there to find. And sure, back in the early 1800s, Louisville was the West. And the West keeps moving, you know. It went out to Dodge City, Kansas in the 1880s, and 20 years later it was in Tombstone, Arizona, and I believe it's in Australia now, so it'll be back. But in the early 1800s, the West was Kentucky, the frontier. But go to Ireland, and they sing the same song. When first I came to Ireland, some pleasure there to find. The West, in the original song, was the West of Ireland. And it was a British soldier singing the song. It's exactly the same song. It's just that they moved the place. So I'm very interested in that. And in quilt patterns, we have forgotten why we use quilt patterns. And a moment's thought will tell you what's going on there. People, you ask somebody, why are you doing this quilt pattern? Well, my grandmother did it. Yeah, and her grandmother did it. But go back far enough, and you're going to find somebody that knows the answer. But unfortunately, far enough is about 700 years. But here's the thing. You can find some of those old quilt patterns carved on rocks in the Orkney Islands, in Ireland, in remote parts of Scotland, and they predate Christianity. And what they were are symbols of magic and protection, old luck symbols. Now think about it. You live hundreds of years ago when medicine is just a guess on somebody's part, when you don't know what causes disease, when you have no control over your environment, and you are making a coverlet to put over your child who is sleeping in the dark when the demons come out. Aren't you going to put on that coverlet every symbol of magic and protection that you can find, just as an extra bit of insurance to keep the baby safe at night? And that's what quilt patterns are. They're old magic. But we forgot that. We kept making the quilts, but we forgot why. And so in my books, I'm sort of a genealogist of the culture, not specifically of my family so much as of the whole family of the Southern Mountains, of trying to tell you what we kept and why we kept it, and why it was important. So you'll find that in my work. And then in some of the later ones, when I deal more directly with history, what I'm doing is acting as a speaker for the dead. There are many people in American history who had interesting lives or who played some key role in a historic event, and they've been forgotten. Because there's so much history and more being added every day, you can't mention everybody. And so some of these people just simply were forgotten. And I try to find these people and write books about them and say to them in my head, if you could talk to people today, what would you want to tell them about yourself? What would you want them to know? And so I try to be a voice for those forgotten people. That would be the Ballad of Frankie Silver, which is the story of the first woman hanged for murder in the state of North Carolina. Because we were under English common law in 1832 when her trial took place, she was not allowed to testify. She never got to tell her side of the story. And when she was on the point of being hanged in Morganton in 1833, and they asked if she had any last words, her father was in the crowd, and he had nothing to do with the trial at all. He was hundreds of miles away when the incident happened. But as she stepped forward and started to speak, her father said, "Die with it in you, Frankie." And she stepped back and was hanged without saying a word. So whatever explanation she wanted to give was silenced. And I wanted to know what she wanted to say. So I spent 4 years doing research on that story. I talked to descendants, I talked to lawyers, deputy sheriffs, a psychic even, everybody I could think of, talked to them all separately. And we all came up with the same answer. And so I think I know what it was that she wanted to say. But I had to do those 4 years of research before I could write the book. And I didn't change anything. I didn't invent any characters or bend the timeline or do anything to alter the historical record, because if I altered anything, it might change the answer. And I didn't want a plausible answer or a pleasant answer. I wanted the truth. Not for you, for me. I personally wanted to know. And so I did as much research as I possibly could. I do a lot of research. The research is the fun part of writing books. The rest of it is like sitting down at your keyboard and doing a term paper for your entire life. And I can't imagine the people who write the same book over and over. I just want to go on to something different. And that's how you have adventures as a writer. You go out and learn things. Don't write about what you already know. Go find things out. So I have sat in Tennessee's electric chair in Riverbend Prison in Nashville, hung out with guys on death row, and asked them interesting questions. I have done laps on the track at Lowe's Motor Speedway in the fire suit and the helmet at 180 miles an hour. I have learned how to load and shoot a Springfield muzzle loader from 1841, because that's what a lot of the Confederate soldiers carried in the war, and probably wish they hadn't. And let's see, what else have I done? Just all kinds of really interesting things, because for me, if you don't experience it, if you don't go there, you're liable to make mistakes. One of the guiding stories for me about why you had better do research comes from the 1940s. In the 1940s, before television, people went to the movies a lot, but they also read a lot of books, not necessarily good books. They read dime novels. You could go through 2 or 3 a week, but it was like TV. You know, they were quick and action-filled, and the really popular ones were Westerns. They sold thousands of Westerns in the 40s. It was an easy way to get published. Almost anybody could publish a Western. But there were a bunch of guys in London who wanted to publish Westerns, but they had never been out of London. And they thought it was a terrible shame that they were being shut out of this marketplace because they didn't know anything about the American West. So they all went to the movies for a month, and they watched Tom Mix and Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy, and they're really soaking up the atmosphere of the American West. And sure enough, they got their books published, and one of them contains my favorite sentence in literature. The guy says, "High overhead in the cloudless blue sky, a coyote hovered." And that is why you do research. Because readers today are smart. And not only are they smart because they've watched a lot of things and seen the world, they're also smart because they have Google about 4 seconds away. So if you make a mistake, if you say something like, he got in the car in Norcross and 10 minutes later got out in Valdosta, you will hear from them. They will get you. So I do very meticulous research. I go to the places, photograph them, and talk to people, do everything I can to get it right. Someone once said that writing novels is putting imaginary toads in real gardens, and the gardens had better be real. Because if a novel is a contract between the reader and the writer. What the writer is saying is, come here, I'm going to tell you a story, and you can trust me. And if I make a mistake that you catch, the contract is broken, you won't trust me anymore. If I tell you it's 10 minutes to Valdosta, then if I say the house is white, you're going to want to walk all the way around it because you don't even believe that, or count the legs on the dog. So I try really hard to get it right and consult a lot of experts and so on. And what I'm writing these days is the stories that nobody else knows about the mountains, that are interesting stories and things that are telling about our culture. And I think I got my style of writing back from those Celts that I'm descended from in Scotland and Ireland. That was an oral culture. They didn't write a lot of stuff down, but there are 5 rules that they had for their bards, 5 rules that guided them, principles, if you will, for crafting a story. First is define a people. Who are these people you're writing about? Where do they come from? What are they like? So that's one thing. Who are we? Second, describe a place. Place is so important especially in the Celtic world. I mean, you remember Scarlett O'Hara hearing her father say, "Land is what matters." And Gerald O'Hara was Irish. Land is what matters. So you describe a place. That's why those people I told you about weren't happy in Florida and had to go find a place that meant something to them. Describe a place. Record history. That's important. If you think the future is simply the past entered through another gate, you had better learn history so you can remember who you can trust, who you had problems with in the past, who the traditional enemies are, especially in Scotland. The clans, the Campbells, you have to remember whose side you're on. The fourth one is transmit cultural values. That's important too, because these stories are going to contain all of the wisdom that you're going to try to pass down to the next generation. So what values does your culture hold? Courage, loyalty, generosity, intelligence. There are many wonderful qualities, but which ones show up over and over in the stories of your heroes? That's a transmission of cultural values. And the last one, which I think a lot of modern novelists have forgotten about, the last one is entertain. The story must be interesting. Because if you pack all of this necessary information into a story to be handed down, and it's got to live after you're gone, people have to retell it and pass it down and down through the generations. And if you make a dull story, that story's going to stop. And then all that other stuff you wanted people to know is going to be lost. So you have to be entertaining. And I try to do all of that. I learned at an early age how fragile culture is. When I was in college, folk music was in the forefront of American culture. We were all listening to Peter, Paul, and Mary and Joan Baez. And so, in lieu of going to some of the more tedious classes at UNC Chapel Hill, I went to the pawn shop in Durham and bought a $10 guitar. And I got somebody to teach me 5 chords. And if you can play 5 chords on a guitar, you can play about 500 songs really badly. So I bought a Joan Baez record, and I went back to my dorm room, and I can play by ear, and plunked out the chords and learned how to play a number of songs from some of her albums. So then when Thanksgiving rolled around, I went home to wow my father with this new skill that his tuition money was making possible. And after dinner, I took him into the living room and sat him down and pulled out my battered little pawn shop guitar and started playing a song which begins, "A fair young maid, all in the garden." And my father joined in. And he was a little Ernest Tubb on the tune, but just letter perfect on the words. And I was horrified. I said, this is the very latest in college music. This is what the cool people in Chapel Hill are singing. How do you know this song? Because I knew my father was not nipping down to the record bar and buying folk music. And my dad said, well, I had that song from my grandmother, and she had it from her grandmother. So I went back after Thanksgiving and read the liner notes on my album by Joan Baez, and it said, this song is a child ballad from the borders of England and Scotland and dates from the late 1700s. So my ancestors had taken this song with them across the ocean from Scotland. They had handed it down from parent to child all the way to my father's generation. And I went to the record bar and paid $6.98 for it. And if Cecil Sharp hadn't preserved those songs, I would never have heard it at all, because my father didn't bother to pass them on. That's important. that transmission of culture, no matter what your culture is, you are still the only link between the past and the future. All the people you knew when you were a child that have passed on now, the only way their memory is going to be kept alive is if you talk about them. The traditions in your family, the sayings, the songs, the stories, all of that is yours to hand on to future generations, and if you don't do it, it's going to be lost. And there's a lot of things that you can't go and pay $6.98 for. They will just be lost. Doesn't it make you sad when you go to a flea market or an antique shop and see piles of photographs that don't have anything written on the back? So we'll never know who those people are. And I know that there are people out there who would have treasured those photographs, and they'll never find them because nobody took a couple of minutes to write the names on the back because they said, oh, we know who they are. But 50 years from now, people won't. So treasure your culture and hand it down. So I'm doing that culturally and doing it with the stories. I've written one book about my own ancestor. That's The Songcatcher, which is about Malcolm McCurry getting kidnapped from the island of Elah and homesteading on the Carolina frontier. But generally what I'm writing about are just the people of the culture. So Frankie Silver, the first woman hanged. Tom Dooley, if you know the folk song, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley, then you have to be reprogrammed because everything you know is wrong. He was not, for example, hanged in a lonesome valley from a white oak tree. He was hanged from a T-post constructed by the sheriff at the railroad depot in downtown Statesville with 10,000 people in attendance. So I did a great deal of work on that story because so much of what we deal with in the mountains are folk tales. They are things that people are telling, handing down, but 5-minute versions of things about what you would find in the song, the Ballad of Tom Dooley. And nobody bothers to do any research. It was difficult, certainly, 100 years ago to look up birth certificates and death certificates and newspaper clippings and all of that. It's getting easier. But back when these stories were just passed down by word of mouth, people got things wrong, or they filled in what they didn't remember and changed things. So what I do is to try to pull these stories out of folklore and put them back into the historical record. I did that with Frankie Silver. Nobody had ever heard of her. Her story had almost been lost until I went back and started unearthing it. And I'm glad I did, because within 10 years of my writing that story, 3 of the people who were the most help in finding the information, the descendant of the sheriff who hanged her, the descendant of one of her brothers-in-law, they were dead. And what they knew died with them. So if I had not interviewed them when I did, that story would have been lost. And there are stories that I just haven't been able to find because I was too late to ask the right people the right questions. Tom Dooley, I kept saying for years that I wouldn't write that story. People have been asking me, because I do write a lot about North Carolina, and everybody would say, when are you going to write about Tom Dooley? And I knew enough about that story to know that if anybody wrote about Tom Dooley, it ought to be Jerry Springer, because that story has got adultery and syphilis and poverty and violence, and it's just not my thing. So then a little magazine called Blue Ridge Country asked me if I would please do a 1,500-word article on the Tom Dooley story. Well, 1,500 words. I could do that much on cream of wheat. So I said, all right, 1,500 words, fine. So I was going to go down there and drive around Wilkes County. If you're going up I-77, Wilkes County, you take 421. And before you get to Boone, you'll be in Wilkes County. So I was going to go down to Wilkes County and see where it happened and do all the research for the story. So I took a friend with me. My oldest friend, who lives in North Carolina still, met me in Wilkesboro, and I put him in the car and we drove around. He knew nothing about the story. He didn't even know the song. So I was the tour guide, and I had read the nonfiction accounts of this story, and I kept explaining it to him, and explaining it, and explaining it. And finally he looked at me and he said, "You do realize that this makes absolutely no sense." And he was right. The story, the way they've always told it, made absolutely no sense. And then I got interested in wanting to know what really did happen. Because if everybody had gotten it wrong for 150 years, let's see if we can sort this out. So I agreed with St. Martin's Press that I was going to write this book, and I put together a team, because by then I had a lot of friends who are academics and historians, and they are mostly based in North Carolina. And so I got a Civil War historian. Tom Dooley was a soldier in the Civil War, and the nonfiction accounts even got his regiment wrong. They could find nothing about his war record. But they were writing those books in the 70s when they were having to go through filing cabinets in the basement of courthouses. I called my historian friend, and he got me Tom's complete war record in an hour, because we've just gotten that much more information available these days. So I had a historian, I had a local genealogist, I had somebody to check on the tax records and the maps and so on to see where everybody lived. I had a lawyer to second chair the attorney who defended Tom Dooley to see if he did a good job or if he had botched the case. So we had a whole bunch of experts putting in all of the technical details we could find. And when the book came out in 2011, there's a community college about 10 miles up the road from where that story happened. And we had a seminar there at the community college, and everybody who was one of my experts got up and talked about what they researched and what they found and how it contradicted the traditional story. And then at the end of the day, we put all the attendees in a van and took them down the 10 miles to where it happened and showed them the graves of Tom Dooley and the grave of Laura Foster, where she was killed, the ridge the body was found on, so they got to see where it really happened. And that brings the story to life. And then all the old ladies in Wilkes County got mad at me because I bought the trial transcript. If you write to the Department of Archives in Raleigh, North Carolina, they will send you the transcript of Tom Dooley's trial for $5. And it completely disagrees with what the old ladies say, because their version of the story is one raccoon short of a Disney movie. And in the trial transcript, the doctor testifies that everybody in the case, Tom, Laura, the murdered woman, and the person Tom really loved, they all had syphilis, so don't Disney me. And they did not, the old ladies didn't disagree with me. They admitted that what I had found was true, but that I just shouldn't say it. Okay. Then I did Kings Mountain, which is about the battle in the American Revolution that happened up here about 26 miles west of Charlotte. If you're driving up I-85, it should take you, from what I've seen of I-85, about 2 months, but you'll get to the South Carolina line, and there are signs for the national park. That's the battlefield. And I had an ancestor who fought in that battle. And that battle is not in the history books. When I took North Carolina history in junior high school, everything was Pennsylvania and north. Concord Ridge, Valley Forge, all of that was north of the Virginia line. And you would think that everybody down here had gone to the beach for 4 years while the war happened. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that Thomas Jefferson called the Battle of Kings Mountain the turning point of the American Revolution. Here's a battle that Thomas Jefferson thought was one of the most important fought in the war, and it's not in the history books. And if there's ever a case of people who played an important part in history and deserved to be remembered, it's them. So that's why I wrote that book. And this time the old ladies were on my side. The National DAR gave me an award for that book. And that brings us to The Unquiet Grave, which is the first book I've ever said in West Virginia. The title, The Unquiet Grave, is child ballad number 78. So it is a ballad novel because the title comes from a ballad and because it tells a story kind of with a moral. There's the cover on the banner there, and I love that cover. I've had a running battle for years with New York about covers because most of them have never left Manhattan, apparently, and they have absolutely no idea what the rest of the world looks like. They seem to think that we out here live in a theme park. So they would be shocked to see a bunch of women from Georgia sitting here not wearing hoop skirts, not holding branches of magnolia, not sipping mint juleps. So I had to fight all this stereotyping, and it's just been a running battle. I've learned to take photographs of the places where books happen so that they won't put palm trees on the cover of my book set in Tennessee. So when I turned in this one, which is the story of the Greenbrier Ghost, it happens in West Virginia in 1897, and it's a true story. The only thing I made up was I don't know what people said to each other because there were no tape recorders running in 1897, so I have to approximate conversations. But the names, the dates, the places, the people, all of that is as accurate as I could make it. So I sent this to New York, and they sent me their first cover, which was a cemetery full of Celtic crosses against a seascape. And I said, there has been no beachfront property in West Virginia in about 250 million years. So their next effort was they were going to do an open grave, and the perspective was that you're looking up through the open grave. But if you didn't know it was an open grave, it looked like a cucumber. So I didn't like that one either. And finally they said the words I've been waiting years to hear. They said, "What do you want?" Well, you know how people on Facebook post images and they almost never credit the person that they got the image from. You don't know who took the picture or who drew the artwork. I found one of those and just loved it, and that's it. I sent it to New York and I said, I know there's a way for people younger than I am to click on something or other on the picture and it will tell you the information about the picture, who took it and when and so on. You know, do that. Because I have sweaters older than everybody in New York. And sure enough, one of their little technocrats clicked and discovered that the artist who did that was Thomas Dodd from Atlanta. And so they called him up and told him they wanted to use his artwork as the book cover, and he very graciously agreed. In fact, when I did the program last night in Marietta, he came and talked and signed posters of the cover. So I was delighted, and I put the cover on Facebook and said, this is by Thomas Dodd, and it's going to be my book cover. And I have friends in Middle Tennessee who have a child actress in the family. And apparently all the child actresses in the Southeast know each other, because when I posted it, they said, that's Aslan, we know her. And sure enough, this is Aslan Freya Pax from Asheville. And they did know her. I guess they all used the same photographers and stylists or something. But anyway, the first leg of this tour, which began on September 10th, was Western North Carolina. And when I signed at Malaprops in Asheville, Aslan came to the store and she signed books. She's 16 years old and she's so excited about being on a book cover. So it's really been a family thing. I've never met the cover artist of one of my books before, and I don't know anybody who's ever met their cover model. So I was really happy with that. And the book is doing well. When I leave here, I'm going to West Virginia because the West Virginia State Library Conference has chosen this as their book of the year. So I'll be speaking to the librarians of West Virginia. It was the West Virginia book at the West Virginia Book Festival. It went into a second printing after 4 weeks, Literary Guild selection. So, you know, it has done well. I think people are interested in this story. And of course, where I live, people knew the folk tale. I live 34 miles from Lewisburg, West Virginia, as the crow flies. If the crow had to drive my Nissan Altima, it would take an hour and a half to get over Potts Mountain and across the border. But I was familiar with the story. There is a historical marker at the end of Greenbrier County, the western end, close to where Zona Heaster is buried. And the marker says, in this county is the only case in American history in which the ghost of a murdered woman convicted the killer. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. You know, let's see, because I'd never heard very much detail about this. It had never been written about, except briefly. So I went to the Greenbrier Historical Society and I said, I'm going to write a book about the Greenbrier ghost. And they said, that's nice, because there are places where I am still more obscure than Paul Newman's first wife. And they had no idea that I had 5 New York Times bestsellers and all of that, and had spoken at Oxford. So I said, could you give me everything you've got on the Greenbrier ghost? And they led me into the gift shop, and they handed me a little book called West Virginia Ghost Stories that covers this in 2 pages. And you could go over those 2 pages with a divining rod and not find a fact. So I was back to square one. I was going to have to do all of the research myself. And I started with the folk tale, discovered all the discrepancies, and figured out why there are discrepancies, because you're going to tell a folk tale in less than 5 minutes while the marshmallows are browning. And if there's anything complex or difficult to explain or that you don't quite understand, folk tale tellers usually just change it. It's a lot easier to change the facts so that you can keep the ball rolling and then your marshmallow doesn't burn. But I was dealing with this story in 110,000 words, and when I found things that were difficult to explain or complex, I had to work them out. And when things didn't make sense, I had to keep digging until they did make sense. That's the thing about doing documentary research. You can find the pieces of paper, but they don't necessarily explain themselves to you. Sometimes what you learn doing research just confuses you. Let me give you my favorite example. A couple of years ago, I won the Library of Virginia Award for a book called St. Dale, which was the Canterbury Tales set in NASCAR. And it's taught in Chaucer classes in 8 states. So, but anyway, in the course of researching that book, and believe me, I had to research that book because when I started, I thought Kurt Busch was the governor of Florida. And I just was in ground zero there on NASCAR. Knew Chaucer, didn't know NASCAR. But I'm a quick study, and so I learned an awful lot about NASCAR and started hanging out with some of the drivers. And there was one guy that I was going to write an in-depth article about. He's the only guy from Virginia who ever won the Daytona 500. So I was interviewing him, and I didn't want to just talk about the racing career. I wanted a feature story about him as a person. And so I started with, tell me about your first dog. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I was 6 years old. And we were a family that liked to go out in the woods and shoot tin cans off of logs and run rabbits. And so I asked my dad if we could have a bagel, B-E-A-G-L-E. And he said yes. And so that was the dog that we wanted, a little brown and black and white, long-eared dog to go out and run rabbits in the woods. So one day, we found a newspaper ad that there was a farmer in the North County that had a dozen beagle pups ready to be given away. So said my dad put me in the car and we went up there. And I got out and went to the pen and looked at all those puppies and I said, they won't do. I don't want any of them. My dog's not here. Let's go home. And I said, You turned down 12 beagle puppies? Yep. I said, were they really beagles? I mean, they weren't like chihuahuas or something. No, they were purebred beagles. Okay, what happened then? He said, well, a couple of weeks later, there was another ad in the paper for Danville, and they had 8 beagle puppies ready to give away, and we got back in the car and went down there, and I looked at those beagle puppies, and they wouldn't do. I said, my dog's not here, take me home. I said, were you planning to breed this dog for $500 puppies or just, show him in the Westminster Dog Show? And the driver said, what's the Westminster Dog Show? He said, all we wanted was a dog to run in the woods. Well, I'm sure that he had just seen 20 dogs that would have run perfectly well in the woods, but he kept turning them down. And I said, do you know anything about breeding dogs and configurations of beagles? Nope, just knew they weren't right. Does that story make sense to you? Because it doesn't to me. I have never seen a 6-year-old child turn down a dog, especially of the breed that he specifically said that he wanted. And I know a couple of Christmases ago, when I was well over 6 years old, we decided we were going to get a dog from the pound for me for Christmas. And so we went to the pound, and what I wanted was a little yappy dog that looks like a dust bunny. You can see the one I have now in the picture there. That's Arthur. Well, this was before we got Arthur, but that's what I wanted, something like that. And they didn't have anything remotely like that at the pound. So we came home with something you could put a saddle on. And I thought, here I am, grown up, and I just took a dog to get a dog. And I would have been afraid at 6 years old that if I had told my father on 2 trips that I didn't want those dogs, we would not be making any more trips to visit dogs. But he said apparently on the 3rd try, they got a satisfactory dog. Well, that story still does not make sense. I don't know any 6-year-old that acts like that, especially one that knows absolutely nothing about dogs. So I waited. I'm sure there are a lot of writers who would have said to themselves, I have had this story firsthand from the person who experienced it, therefore it must be true. My motto is, if you hear a story and it doesn't make sense, it means you're missing a piece of the puzzle. Keep digging. So I waited. And a few months later, I was back down there visiting with him when his father walked in. So I told the winner of the Daytona 500 to sit down and be quiet because I was going to talk to Daddy. And I said, tell me about your son's first dog. And his dad said, oh yeah, Rebel the first. He said, well, I was driving down Highway 15501 on the way to Durham, and in the median between the 2 highways, I saw a little dog, the beagle, with its head stuck in a mayonnaise jar. And so I pulled over to the side of the road and went over there. I couldn't get the jar off the dog's head. He tried to lick the mayonnaise out of the jar and got stuck. He said I took a rock, broke the jar, but I still couldn't get that rim off of his neck. So I picked him up and took him home, and we filed that glass ring off of his neck, and then we kept that puppy. And I said, did you? And then I asked the question, did that dog die when your son was 6 years old? And he said, why, yes, it did. How did you know? And I said, because now that crazy story makes sense. Beagles, have configurations of markings. They're black and brown and white, but they don't all look the same. Some have white patches here or a brown here. They're all different. So you take the little boy who's just lost his dog, and you take him to the pen, and he looks at those dogs and he says, my dog's not here. He's trying to match the markings on the beagle that died. But when he told me that story 40 years later, he had forgotten why he was so picky about dogs. He remembered turning them down, but he had forgotten why. And I kept digging until the story made sense. And that's the way I do research. I'll look not only at the story. With Frankie Silver, the folklore said that she was hanged from a platform, you know, one of those trapdoor things like you see in Western movies. I did research of every hanging I could find and could not find any hanging within 20 years of when she was executed that used a platform and a trapdoor, except the hanging of John Brown in Charlestown, West Virginia in 1859. Charlestown, Virginia it was then, 1859, which was conducted by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Well, if you've got their expertise and you've got their budget, you can do all kinds of fancy things. But she was hanged by a one-term county sheriff in a tiny little town in North Carolina, and I don't think he had the money or the expertise to build a platform. So you have to look at everything when you're doing research to try to make sense of things. And that's what I did with the Unquiet Grave. I knew in the beginning that it was not the only case ever of this happening. There was a precedent in England in 1827, and I wanted to know if there was a connection between those two stories. Nobody who's ever written about this case knew about the case in England, but I did, and I was looking for a connection. But more than that, I was looking at the people. This is a look at the community of Greenbrier, West Virginia in 1897. And I discovered that the lawyers were two Civil War veterans who had fought on opposite sides, and that the defense attorney, who had been pro-union to the point of palling around with the invading soldiers and helping them burn bridges, he had owned slaves. So he was a contradiction. And when you got to the trial, 1897, he's an old man, had sold his slaves so that he wouldn't lose money when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. But now it's 35 years later. He's a defense attorney in court, and his second chair, his assistant attorney for that trial, was the first African-American attorney to practice in southern West Virginia. And so another thing that I do when I look at cases is to say, whose story is it? Whose point of view are you going to tell this story from? It's got to be somebody who can be a good guide to the time and place, and it also has to be the person who cares the most. And in this story, the person who cared the most was the mother of the murdered bride. So Mary Jane Heaster had demanded that the prosecutor do an autopsy and find out how Zona was murdered. And she told him that Zona's ghost had come back and claimed that she had not fallen down the stairs, as the husband had said, but that she had been strangled. And they did an autopsy, and it bore that out. So the fact that Mary Jane made a 20-mile ride in a horse and wagon over muddy, unpaved roads in February to hunt up the district attorney, and the fact that she would not leave or turn loose until he agreed to prosecute, made me think that she's the one that cares the most. And she's perfectly capable of telling you the story of Zona and the marriage and the funeral and all of that, but she can't tell you about the trial because she doesn't know anything about the legal system, and she's probably only been to town at all once or twice in her life because she lives 20 miles away on a tiny farm in the mountains. So I had to have somebody else to tell the story from the point of view of someone who knew the law. And my choice was the African-American attorney, James P.D. Gardner, because he's 29 and he's a stranger culturally, and so he's watching these two old bulls from the Civil War go at each other in court. And I tracked everybody in this case with census records and birth certificates, death certificates, everything. And when I got to 1930, I discovered that my 29-year-old lawyer, Mr. Gardner, who's now 63, is in a segregated insane asylum over on the Ohio River in the western part of West Virginia. Then I had to figure out why he was there. And the obvious answers did not hold up. First guess would have been, hey, he's 63, maybe he has early onset Alzheimer's, maybe he has some kind of organic brain disease. But I kept looking at records, business records from where he practiced law. A year and a half after winning the insane asylum, he's out practicing law again. Now, if you have Alzheimer's, you don't get out and go back to work. So I had to figure out what would put him in an asylum for a year and a half and then allow him to get out. And I decided that what I was going to do to tell the legal part of the story was to have him tell the story to his psychiatrist in the asylum. And so the story opens in the asylum. So it's as true as I can make it, and I am still doing research because on this book tour, I have gone to a lot of places that are tied in to the story. Last Saturday, I met the great-great-nephew of the man who was convicted of the murder and found out all sorts of stories from him, found out where the home place was, the cemetery where Trout Shoe's parents are buried. So I've just been unearthing all of these things as I go along. And I guess it's just kind of hard to let go. When you're writing about real people, you feel like you know them. And you really are speaking for them because they can no longer speak for themselves. And you just want to find out one more thing. And it's always one more thing. So I'm still researching. I'll be back in Greenbrier County on Tuesday and probably still looking for the last little bits of things that I haven't worked out yet. I don't need them for the book, can't revise the book. It's just me being nosy. So thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions, let me know.
Do you finish all of your research before you start writing, or do you proceed on kind of parallel tracks?
Do you finish all your research before you start writing?
Yes. I did finish all the research before I started writing. For what, in the book, the two narrators are Mary Jane Heaster, Zona's mother, and the African-American lawyer. Neither one of them knew Trout for longer than a couple of weeks. So all the stuff I'm looking at now about where he grew up and what his parents were like, where his parents are buried, none of that could have even been put in the book because they wouldn't have known it. I am confined by what the narrators themselves would know. Now I'm just interested. But I did do all the research I needed and more for the book. I went to Moundsville, the prison that he was in, got locked in one of those cells to see what it was like, because they were locked in those cells without heat or light for 16 hours a day. I lasted about 2 minutes. But yes, I do the research. No, not necessarily before I start. You can't do everything before you start because you'll always run up against something you don't know you needed to know. So I do enough research to get a good start on the book, but I'm always going back and checking things all along. And there are some things that it takes a while to find. The psychiatrist that he is dictating the story to from the asylum, that was a 29-year-old psychiatrist from Westchester, New York. I knew that going in, but I didn't have a photograph of him, and I didn't have very much biographical details. I knew he went to Lincoln University, he went to Howard Medical School, but I pictured him as solemn and stuffy and overeducated and very dignified and conscious of his position. So basically a young Morgan Freeman. And then about 2 weeks before I had to turn in the book, we found a photograph of him in the Howard Medical School yearbook. And I took one look at him. He's got a little toothbrush mustache, and he's cocky, and they had to censor his comment in the yearbook. And I said, that's not Morgan Freeman, that's Chris Rock. And it made sense. Once I saw him, I realized this guy was born in September of 1900, and he's one subway ride away from New York City. So he's coming of age in the 1920s, in the jazz age. He's going to the Cotton Club. He's listening to blues and jazz and all of this stuff down in the clubs in the city. No, he's not stuffy and pompous. He thinks he's the coolest person in West Virginia, and he's probably right. The stuffy and pompous one is Mr. Gardner, the 63-year-old attorney who was born in 1867. He's the one who's very dignified and so on. And so it made a perfect counterpoint. The 29-year-old lawyer is now a 63-year-old patient, and his doctor is 29. They're from different centuries, effectively. And they're from different worlds. One's from New York, one's from rural West Virginia, and there's a lot of effort that has to be made for them to understand each other's cultures and not make assumptions. So there's a lot of that going on.
Thank you. Why did Trout kill her? I mean, he didn't know her that long, right?
Why did Trout kill her? He didn't know her that long, did he?
What?
Why did Trout kill her?
Oh, you'll have to read the book. Okay, well, I'll go sign books. There is a book of photographs here. If you want to see what they looked like and where it happened and so on, I put this book together and send it to New York so they won't put palm trees on the cover. But I kept one because people are interested in knowing the people and places in the book. And they're all just as I described them, so here they are.
If I could ask you to keep your seats for just a minute while we have a couple of closing announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and I'd also like to ask you to give a hand to Mrs. McCrumb. That was just fascinating. Just fascinating.